Special Education Advocacy, What It Is and What It Isn't, with Dr. Allison Conch, CERC Assistant Director, Ellen Kimbrell, OPC Associate Director, and Abby Johnson, OSDE Project Manager. December 3rd, 2025, CERC's Wisdom Wednesday webinar series. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Wisdom Wednesday webinar. I'm Alyssa Hullaby. I'm the program manager for CERC, like Rob just mentioned, and I'm happy to introduce today's panelists. We have Dr. Allison Conch from CERC, the assistant director, presenting, as well as Abby Johnson, who is a project manager with the State Department of Education, and Miss Ellen Kimbrell, who is an associate director with the Oklahoma Parent Center. These ladies are part of our partner agencies, and we are very happy to be able to present over special education advocacy today. So I am going to turn it over to these ladies, and I will be monitoring the chat and Q&A.
There we go. So for today's presentation, we will be dividing it into 4 different sections. We'll do some introductions, and then we'll go into an explanation of the purpose of advocacy and parental support, and then kind of talk about the differences between inquiry and interactions, and then end with a discussion regarding advocates as either allies or adversaries. And as Alyssa mentioned, I'm a project manager at the Oklahoma State Department of Education, and in our office, our mission is to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. We are focused on ensuring that students receive the services and supports that they need to continue their education. And through Dr. Coates' leadership, we are working to ensure that students remain the focus every single day.
And like Alyssa had mentioned, I'm here for CERC, and we are a third-party neutral organization. We provide the dispute resolution services on behalf of the State Department of Education Special Ed Services. And our mission is to help parents and schools resolve disputes at the earliest stage possible, which includes a multitude of formal and informal services, as well as trainings like this to help educate parents, schools, and community members to hopefully help prevent disputes when possible.
Yes, hello. Ellen Kimbrell, like was mentioned before, with the Oklahoma Parent Center, and we are the federally funded parent training information for the state of Oklahoma. And our mission is to train and inform families about their rights and responsibilities under IDEA and related laws of 504 and, of course, ADA. So we truly believe in building relationships with public schools and partnering with them and the agencies that we partner with here, because we believe when the families and the schools are working together collaboratively, that the focus remain on the student, that's where the student is going to be best get the services in that environment.
So, as we've all introduced ourselves, the 3 of us, OSDE, SCS, CERC, and OPC, we share a unified mission, and that is to support families and schools in working together effectively to develop child-centered, relationship-based approaches to problem solving. And in today's presentation, we will explain what genuine advocacy entails. We'll kind of talk about a few misconceptions, and we'll also offer guidance to help parents choose an advocate with confidence.
So family training and support is oftentimes can be your front line to when you have concerns. And I will just plug, I've been with the Parent Center for 25 years, and we don't get calls from happy families. And so we have to start where they're at and try to help them navigate through the conflict. And as we've learned, as we know through our daily engagement with families and coworkers and just life in general, conflict is just part of life. And so we just really try to support the family in where they're at and working with, starting with trying to, because sometimes they don't even know what the concern is. And so just helping them identify the concerns and navigate what their next step might be. And but as far as advocacy for the Parent Center, our goal is to empower the parent to learn and understand their rights so they can become the best advocate for their child. We tell them, every one of us at the Parent Center, we don't have a voice at the table. You have the voice. Our job is to help you find your voice. So that's just kind of a plug for the Parent Center. But anyway, an educational advocacy, we are known by many different names. It could be parent advocate, child advocate, student, independent. I've heard legal advocate. Many different titles given. Professional advocates provide information, guidance, support throughout the IEP process to encourage those next step decisions that meet the needs of the student. And we really work hard to try to keep the focus on the student, on the child. I don't call myself a parent advocate. I am there for the child. So. So what is advocacy? It is supporting parents in understanding their rights. I'm a parent of an adult child now, or adult with the disabilities, and continue to support him. So I started early when he was 3, and just helping and understanding my rights made all the difference for our journey through special education. So that is one of my passions, is to help families know and understand their rights, to help them stay focused. At the Parent Center, we work really hard not to get caught up in the emotions of it, because it is very emotional for families, and we try to help them, kind of empower them to speak for the child and model respectful, collaborative communication, which is so important, because you've got to communicate effectively and collaboratively in order to move forward past the conflict. And so advocacy is not, we never, ever, ever speak for families. That is not our job to go in and talk for parents or sign documents or anything. We sign that we attend. That's the only document we sign. We're not the IEP police. We don't tell schools what to do, or we assist them. We will certainly help them. We are an advocacy group that will assist anyone that calls us if they have questions. But we're certainly not the special ed police. And then we do not act as an attorney. We're not attorneys. We don't pretend to be attorneys, and we don't give legal advice or interpret any kind of law. So in a nutshell, there's lots more, but
I think those points are really important, Ellen, because the deal is, like when you said speaking for the parents or helping them speak for themselves, the IDEA affords meaningful parental participation. So that's perfect, because that they're supposed to be the participant on the IEP team, not that advocate. And then, of course, we've got things in Oklahoma regarding advocates and their ability to represent families in certain cases. There's an attorney general opinion. It's actually posted on our website regarding this, whether advocates can represent families in a way that an attorney can. So advocates still have to be really careful about that, because even drafting those documents or speaking for them could come across that way. And you're right, empowering the parents is so important, because it is their child. You as the advocate are not the one that's going to be the one dealing with the decisions made through that IEP team process of regarding the child's education. So I think that's a really important point. Okay. So let's talk about progress versus perfection. Andrew F., which is a Supreme Court case, started as a due process hearing and continued up. This actually replaced the Rowley decision from back in the day as to what constitutes free and appropriate public education. And the court issued a unanimous opinion that the schools are obligated to offer an IEP reasonably calculated. Okay, so the student will make progress in light of their circumstances. I think a lot of times what we'll deal with is some miscommunication or misunderstanding that that means, oh, the child's on an IEP, so that special ed services, those services will get them caught up to grade level, or it must mean they must get these specific things. It's all unique to the child's individual needs, and it's all what's appropriate. Okay. Parents can certainly elect, this is a conversation we have to have with parents sometimes, is they can elect to maximize their child's benefit. Parents can do additional things beyond what the school can provide. And that school is obligated to provide that progress. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be perfect. That's not what that obligation is. And I think that can be confusing. And sometimes parents then want the advocate to come in and collect that pound of flesh and so to speak from the school or make them do the thing like you mentioned earlier. And that's not what the IDEA requires, first of all, in terms of what they must provide for the student, nor is that the role for the advocate, like you had mentioned earlier, Ellen.
So one of the common misconceptions regarding advocates is that there is the belief that there's an official certification process similar to what exists for teachers or paraprofessionals. And this is not the case. There is not a state or nationally recognized certification for advocates. And this is something that is important for families to keep in mind when selecting their advocate. And we'll talk about this later on in the presentation, but it's important to note that there is not a certification process for an advocate.
Okay.
So, in kind of bringing that back to what the true role of advocacy is in going back to our mission of information and training here at the Parent Center, and what we would like to see happen is training families how to learn and understand and support them through the process, giving them confidence. You can't imagine how much just allowing them to know that you're on the right track and giving them the confidence to know that they can do this. And then encouraging self-advocacy with the student as early as possible. Focus so highly, I can't speak this enough, to focus on the collaborative, constructive communication, even through anger. I tell families sometimes, write the email, or write the letter, whatever, but don't send it, get your emotions out. But and then come back and we'll talk about how to write a more collaborative, constructive problem solving. That's one of the things we want to help families with, and school districts as well, is thinking outside the box and coming up with different problem solving ideas for the families and anyone that calls. And then understanding their procedural safeguards. It's important for them to know what those are. And then generating those, again, those out of the box ideas to think about.
And like Ellen had mentioned earlier, that conflict's going to happen sometimes. You're talking about human beings, right? And you're talking about a child with a disability, which can be very complex. And so people might have different opinions on how to meet a need or how to come together about a certain situation. And sometimes people's backgrounds and your perceptions about a situation or your beliefs or your values or your goals make you feel like this is true and this is what's necessary. Well, there's a group of people who might feel differently. So the perception of what has happened or should happen or is going to happen is not always that whole picture, that full reality. And it's really important for people to be able to find common ground and work through that conflict because it likely is to happen. That doesn't mean it has to be a fight or this big negative situation. There are ways to work through it collaboratively. And then the separating positions from interest. This is huge. We see this so much is that people are focused, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later too, about a specific position, a specific outcome, rather than focusing on what the interest is. It's the strategy versus the purpose, right? The strategy of how you do the thing might not really matter in the grand scheme as long as you're working towards that same purpose or goal. Okay. So we hear lots of conflict because maybe a parent will ask, "Hey, I want a para." And a school will say, "No, we want to do this." Well, they're focused on those positions rather than that underlying interest about what problem are we trying to solve, what need are we trying to meet. So really getting to the root of the issue instead of saying focused on here's my idea, here's the need. So that's really an important thing for parents and schools to focus on, and the advocates can help get to the root of that as well. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit more about that collaboration that Ellen had mentioned. Schools and parents are partners for a really long time. And so when you go through that conflict, it is important to try to collaborate as much as possible because staying in the land of fighting for, 12, 13, maybe more years is taxing and difficult and doesn't necessarily benefit the child. So we're going to talk a little bit about why collaboration is important.
To start our discussion on collaboration, one of the things that research shows is that when families and schools are willing to work together, willing to think of out of the box ideas, the satisfaction for both the parents and the school increases. And it shows that the collaborative approach helps keep the focus not only on the student, but the student's needs, which ultimately helps to improve the student's outcomes and support their continued success. And so on the next slide, it kind of expands on that in the sense of when schools and families are willing to work together, as Allison mentioned, they're going to work together for a long time. And, that is something that is often difficult to keep in mind when there are contentious issues that arise. And so I think one of the things that, our three agencies really, stress or champion is that idea of, hey, let's work together, let's come up with unique solutions, let's see what we can get to, so that at the end of the day we're not enemies amongst each other.
All right, so Cadre, which is the National Dispute Resolution Organization. It's the Center for Appropriate Dispute Resolution in Special Ed. They are like CERC, actually, but on a national level. So they are partnered with OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, through the Department of Education, and provide guidance and technical assistance to states, state education agencies, agencies like CERC, and parent training centers. So that's their role. So they have a lot of resources out there, and we've linked it here so that when the webinar is archived and the presentations on our website here in a couple of weeks, people can even access this and the Cadre guide. But we've pulled some components of it out. It's a longer guide, so we've pulled a couple of components to focus in on and talk about Cadre and the federal guide to how to be a collaborative advocate. And that first one is really being child-centered. The child is at the center of this. It's the child with a disability, and that's what the focus needs to be on regarding all of the decisions the team is making. Sometimes conversations can lose focus and get targeted on maybe the adults in the room or past conflict or whatever the case may be. But the collaborative advocacy should keep that focus centered on the child and redirect. We're talking about a child's needs and how to get those educational needs met.
And then well, I've talked a little bit, we probably all have, about empowerment. And one of the vital roles as an advocate is making sure that we are helping the family, encouraging them to have that meaningful parental participation. And how to best do that is to make sure they know and understand the process. Parents, come in not knowing a lot about the process. And so educating them about that and their procedural safeguards, helping them clarify and prioritize and articulate their concerns, have an agenda for the meeting, the vision for their child's educational services, the future, how to prepare parents and their student to participate effectively in their meetings, and helping to ensure that parents gather the information necessary to be informed, reviewing that IEP before they go in, reviewing the documents, and being better prepared for the meeting. We encourage that collaboratively for not only problem solving, but being prepared, because that helps the process for everyone in the meeting. So.
This made me think of something, Ellen, and I don't know if other people have ran into it as well, but I've met with teams that have asked advocates to be a part of the team, and it's just something that I feel like needs to be put out there that advocates are not a part of the team. It's part of that empowerment to have that parental participation. Um,
Right. You're right, Alyssa. Like I said before, we are not members of the team. And we make that clear to parents that we're not a member of the team. We explain to them that the active members of an IEP team, and explain to them that we're not a member. And so all the more reason for them to learn and understand their rights, and just moving forward, because we're not going to be there for every meeting, right? So.
And you're right. And that's also a position, advocates shouldn't put themselves in anyways, right? Because if you were to tell the parent what to do, rather than empower them and help come up with possible solutions or ideas, if you were to tell them what to do and they were to go with your advice and it didn't go so well, whose fault is that going to be? And their perception, right? And it's ultimately their child, and they're that parental team member that's got to be able to participate. So I think that's a really good point. All right, so again, back to that whole collaborative component, is that a collaborative advocate, of course, should be collaborative. This is the visual of what I had mentioned earlier, regarding the separating the positions from the interest. The position is like that visible part of the iceberg. When all you focus on is that, you miss that underlying, that underneath interest as to what actually needs to be discussed. We get so focused on, well, here's my idea for a solution, rather than here's the need that needs to be addressed. And if people focus on the need and that interest, it can encourage that creative thinking and it gets people unstuck. So I think it's really important that collaborative advocates approach things in that way and focus on that interest-based approach, where all the parties, schools can listen to those advocates when they're focused on the interest-based rationale, right? Rather than positioning themselves in a certain way, then schools can hear that. And those interest-based advocates can help the parents hear the different perspectives and ideas from the school when, again, you're focused on the interests rather than a position or a specific demand to be met. It keeps that conversation going.
Allison, in the Q&A, Katie Ho mentioned that it is impossible to know all the rules and laws without a special education advocate, and she is so grateful for theirs. And so that's just a big shout out for advocacy.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's super important. Yeah, we are definitely not saying that parents should not use advocates. We just want to make sure that there's a clear understanding of what that role looks like, since they're not the team member, all right? And the IDA does not afford for their participation. But I love that you have an advocate that's helpful and great and can help educate you on those things. So that's great. Okay, so continued collaboration is again just listening for understanding. And this is again what advocates need to be helping parents and schools to do, right? And separating the people from the problem, right? We get caught up in that conflict when it happens. And then sometimes people tend to, excuse me, demonize or villainize an individual. And I get that that can happen. Like we're not saying that this never occurs or that all people and human beings are perfect. That's not the case. But being able to move past that and focus on the problem. Advocates can also help identify areas where there is agreement. Is start with that stuff that, hey, we do agree on this. Maybe when you're separating positions from interests, we agree, right? This is an interest, this is a need we need to focus on, and we're on the same page here. So let's open up the door in the discussion to how to get that interest or that need met, and then helping to identify and evaluate potential solutions. We get kind of into this with when parents or schools call us here at Circ as well. Well, we'll have parents and schools say, well, what do we do? Well, I can't tell you what to do because ultimately you're the school or you're the parent. Here are some ideas you could consider. Just like advocates might say, hey, we've seen in other meetings where there's a student like this, where the school did this. Is that something that might be possible here? But being able to kind of go through pros and cons and help the evaluative component of those ideas, again, rather than getting stuck on the position, is just super. It can open that door for so much more discussion.
With that, when you are in IEPT meetings and you're thinking about the different aspects that go into those, one of the most important things is the relationship building piece. And that is to not only strengthen the communication between all the team members, but also to be able to improve the outcome for the student and focus the discussions or the needs upon the student. And one of the main things that when I think about relationship building amongst team members is the aspect of respect and being respectful to each other and to those that are speaking, and really trying to be solution oriented towards the student, because at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to make as good of progress regarding the student if the team is constantly fighting or constantly disagreeing on things. And I think that there's that really big piece of, hey, we might not all agree with each other, most days, but when it comes to the student, we have to set our differences aside and focus on them and what is best for them.
I love that point, Abby, about hey, we may not agree on all the things. And I think even as colleagues, when we have discussions, right, we can say that, hey, I don't necessarily agree with this particular idea. Here's where we do align. Could we have these discussions about how to move forward here? Or, hey, I don't necessarily 100% agree with that thing, but I see that you're passionate about it. I'm not wholly in disagreement, so I'm okay to move forward on that piece, right? It's that skill, which is a difficult skill, I think, to be able to move forward and through that disagreement, respectfully. But I know that that can be really hard when you're talking about a kid with a disability. So that's another way that advocates can be helpful through building that relationship is helping to take the heightened emotions away sometimes to get focused on, yes, we get it, it's your baby. I mean, my gosh, I've got a kid with a disability, I get it. But making sure you're focused on meeting that need and still building those relationships because of the partnership that you've got to have. Okay.
I continuing with that, one of the main things that I think that, we all, OPC Circ and myself with the OSDE one of the things that is really interesting or intricate about special education is that it is constantly evolving and changing. And, as professionals within special education, we are constantly looking up new research or hearing about different things that are going on. And the same principle applies to advocates. Advocates, just like many other professions, are in need of that, continuing education, staying up to date on what's happening regarding special education. What are the new, you know, proposed changes or proposed ideas, and really trying to be more knowledgeable to not only improve their own profession, but also to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And then continuing with that again, just the emphasis on, you know, staying up to date. One of the things that is important with this is just not only for the advancement or the knowledge base of the advocate, but also, schools may not sometimes be, the most up to date on things, or, there may be, parents who, are unfamiliar, and being as an advocate, having the ability to inform when necessary is important, and also, point to resources or even just, current research, things like that.
I think that's a good point, in terms of being able to be vulnerable to even say, "Hey, I don't know, I don't have this answer," and I don't always know the answer to certain things either, or some things might be out of our agency's wheelhouse when we get a call, right? Of like, well, that's not something that we can handle. Um, we will direct you here, but just being really cautious about that and what information is being passed on. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what sort of questions parents should ask themselves if they're considering an advocate, and what questions they should ask advocates when they're determining whether they should use one, which type of advocate, if there's certain types of approaches, and getting to understand their background and their approach and that type of thing.
So, when parents are asking themselves, do I need an advocate? Is it time for an advocate? I'm not feeling like I'm heard. So you want to start with asking yourself these questions, like what challenges am I facing in the IEP meetings? What part am I not understanding or not being able to navigate well, um, to address my child's educational needs? What might other things or goals, that I might want to be included in that and better understand, or something else that, and maybe I don't know. As a parent, maybe I don't know. And maybe that, if the right advocate could help me come up with some of those questions to ask. And have I spoken to the right people at the school district? We tell families oftentimes when they call, have you used the chain of command? Because, when you're talking about communication and effective communication, chain of command is very important. And so we try to encourage families to start there, start with that chain of command. When we're talking to families. But if you're asking yourself that as a parent, maybe I need to talk to someone else, or do I understand my rights? And you ladies, please, if you have something else to add, because you have been, you advocate and you talk to families to help them understand their rights as well. So please add anything that you feel is worthy to add as far as questions, because sometimes parents don't know. We don't know what we don't know. So
I think that's a great point. I think some of the things that you're talking about here, Ellen, is again just getting them in that right frame of mind of what is it that I'm wanting? What are my challenges or what are my expectations from an advocate? Because like we mentioned before, advocates can't control the process. They're not there to get a pound of flesh, right? I mean, we've heard that before of, well, I want the school to be held accountable. An advocate doesn't do that. Uh, there are other agencies like the State Department is responsible for monitoring and enforcing compliance and things like that with the school district. And so doing stuff like that or asking, having that be your goal might not be the right route to have an advocate because that's not the capacity or within the wheelhouse of what an advocate can or should be doing, really.
That's true. So when you're selecting or you're looking at selecting an advocate, you do want to look at what kind of training and experience do they have? Um, what is their, when I talk to families, I will ask them, what is your expectation of the Oklahoma Parent Center and me specifically as I'm assisting you? Because I think that helps them even ask the questions better because oftentimes they're calling, but they don't really know what we are, or what we do, or how we can help. They just know somebody told them, call them, they're advocates, they can come with you. And so you you want to be able to know that the person that's going to be going in either supporting you in the process that they're knowledgeable, that they're giving you accurate information to support. I that's one thing that Sharon and I have worked very hard is we do not give out accurate information. If we do, we will certainly retract and own up. But we worked very hard not to give out inaccurate information. And so that would be one of the things that I would think would be one of my most important questions as a parent. What kind of information training do you have? What are some additional trainings to navigate early dispute resolution? Because again, the procedural safeguards are there. But if your child's 5 and you're going to live in this district until they graduate, it's going to be in your best interest to try to navigate these disputes early as possible and build that relationship with that district. So important. Um, and then just, parent advocates are also parents. Everyone at the Parent Center is either a parent or a person with a disability. So we've navigated that on our own. And I'm not a perfect advocate or a perfect parent, but certainly I want to empower parents to know how to operate through this process because it is overwhelming, no doubt, as the Q&A person mentioned. It can be completely overwhelming to understand, and advocates can play a major role in helping families understand the process. That's very true. So, um, and then selecting an advocate, you want to talk about that parent advocate relationship. My goal is not to have a parent long term. My goal is to assist them to move forward and of course call and support them as often. But as a parent, if I'm a parent and I'm asking myself this question, I would not want that advocate to be I I would want to learn it so I could be the voice, and my son is profoundly deaf, and so that's one of the things that we have to give people voices, and if you're not feeling heard and an advocate goes in a wrong capacity and you haven't discussed that relationship prior, there can be some damage that can take place that takes a while to rebuild the trust. And this takes trust because we're leaving our children with individuals and we're wanting the best for them, as all parents do. So anyway, advocates should never push a parent to do anything that is not in the best interest of the child. This is not, I tell parents all the time when I'm talking to them, this is your life, your child. I can't make that decision for you. Here are your options. Here's some ideas, strategies, of course. But I would never want to encourage a parent. Parents sometimes will call and say, um, well, what district should I enroll my child in because we're moving? And these are the choices. Much like Allison said, we don't recommend because if it didn't work out, so you want to build that relationship, but you also want to go in knowing that your goal as a parent is to advocate for yourself and your child. Sorry, I
Ladies,
probably went too long.
oh
Great.
no, it's great, Ellen. We do have a comment in the Q&A from Miss Carmen Haley, and she says, for several years, we've advocated for our child in a collaborative, student-focused way. We've always maintained positive, respectful relationships with our school team and come prepared to offer informed parental input. However, when we raise concerns or disagree and ask for continued conversation, the district often shuts down those discussions. As a result, we frequently leave IEP meetings with no meaningful changes, even when our requests align with our child's documented needs. Despite educating ourselves on our child's rights, our input is repeatedly minimized. At this point, we feel that another voice at the table is needed to help speak up for our child. IDEA provides parents the option to bring in an advocate for additional support. What is the appropriate next step when a district's response creates conflict rather than collaboration? And can you speak to a parent's right to include an advocate in an IEP?
Yeah, is it sorry, I want to address the person by name. Who put that
Yeah,
in there?
Carmen.
Okay. Carmen, you're right. Yeah, parents can bring whomever they would like to bring to an IEP meeting. You can bring a guest. So again, this is not us saying parents shouldn't have advocates, and I hope that that's not how it's coming across in any way. We just want to make sure that we're talking about that it should empower the parents. And I hear your concerns and issues, and that's when dispute resolution comes into play if needed. And like what Ellen mentioned, there's some early options for dispute resolution. And it's not like you have to climb the ladder of all the stages of dispute resolution. They are afforded to parents, okay, as part of their procedural safeguards. But the more that can be resolved early, the better off things are with your relationship. So, in using those parent rights, those are very appropriate. And I think, we mentioned it earlier that this is not us saying everybody's perfect and that doing these things are always going to be perfect, that it's always going to work out without additional needs for other supports. The focus is just about advocacy and that best approach, and the guidance from the national federal organization from Cadre. But those other procedural safeguards are always afforded to parents. That's what they're there for. Abby and Ellen, I don't know if you guys have anything else to add. I'm so sorry if I just totally took over on that answer.
No, I think what you said is spot on, and that, what first came to mind when Alyssa was reading the question was, I wonder if they have considered IEP facilitation or even mediation,
Mhm.
and using that as a stepping stone to see what can be resolved. I know that, we often get, similar phone calls from parents who are in situations where they feel that they need that extra voice. And, that is absolutely up to the parent. If they feel that they need that extra voice, then absolutely, but I think it's using the resources such as, IP facilitation or mediation, or even speaking with the, special education director. I've oftentimes, parents, don't consider that, and that can sometimes be a valuable resource. But just, knowing that you have resources or options available to you is equally important.
And I think one thing that was popping in my head as we were thinking of talking, Abby, is back also considering back to what's in Drew F, right? Is sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a parent of a child with a disability. The school is required to provide what is appropriate in light of the child's circumstances, okay? To make reasonable progress, right? But as a parent, we can always maximize their benefit. So what I want, exactly what I want, my position might not be exactly what the school does, right? But if we can meet those interest-based needs in order for the child to make progress, then that's what the school's obligated to do. And I certainly can take my child to do other things to build different skills, if that makes sense. So sometimes people get caught up in that too, and that conflict it can be difficult to resolve, and I understand that. I get it. So I hope that our kind of how we've answered here makes sense, and our purpose today is clear.
Um, she has also said that in our district, parents are often discouraged from doing so. In some cases, families have even been told that if they bring an advocate, the district will respond by bringing their attorney. How should parents navigate situations where the district's reaction to an advocate feels intimidating or punitive? And what guidance can you offer on maintaining a collaborative IEP process when a parent's lawful choice to seek support is treated as a threat rather than a partnership too?
That's a really good question.
Great questions. Yeah.
Typically, what we've seen when a district does that, when they bring their attorney, usually because they're feeling either, there's a couple of situations where we've seen districts do it because they're feeling confused or want to make sure that they're on the right track. We've seen some districts say, we're bringing our attorney because we want to make sure we're making the right decision. Okay. When we talk to districts, I will say we typically discourage them from bringing an attorney if the parent does not have one. However, each party can choose to have legal representation if they so choose. So we can't interfere in an attorney-client relationship. Or sometimes, if districts are bringing an attorney, it's because they feel like things have been combative. And I don't know the exact situation, obviously, but so I want to make sure I'm answering your question. How should you approach it when you feel like you've been collaborative? And how to move forward, I think is kind of what your question was. Was that accurate, Alyssa? I know you're reading it. Does that capture it?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Um, I think sometimes again navigating through conflict, it's so hard, okay? And if there's been that broken relationship and that lack of trust at this point and that kind of what feels combative, right? Or conflict, very hard, difficult, deep conflict. Another thing is to address that elephant in the room. And CERC can also support that too. We can provide not just IEP facilitation, but a facilitation for a meeting where sometimes there might have to be a meeting or a conversation about a relationship reset, okay? And how to rebuild that. And Rob, I know, Dr. Cutter, I know you're on here, and I don't know if you want to talk further into this or not, but where a facilitator can come and help the parties communicate together, not necessarily just an IEP meeting, just rebuilding the relationship. How do we move forward to meet the needs of the child? Here's the history, here's what we feel like about the relationship, and here's how we want to move forward. And that facilitator, as a neutral person, can help actually really guide that discussion to try and rebuild that relationship. So that's another thing that we can help do so that families and schools can get along and move forward. I hope that answered your question. And I don't know if anybody else has anything else to add on that.
I was just going to say, Allison, I mean, I think what you shared is right. And probably in that kind of a situation, it might be really beneficial to have a facilitator to help the team.
Mhm.
And maybe in that, in that environment might be able to address some things that could help rebuild a relationship as well. But and that is where we see sometimes parents and sometimes even schools requesting a facilitator for an IEP meeting when they see the kind of environment that it is, that it's not collaborative, and they just feel like they need some help to move it in that direction. But those things are definitely a possibility. Yeah.
Okay. I think, Ellen.
And it kind of goes back to the importance of when you're selecting or you're thinking about an advocate and talking about that relationship, making sure, because, it's easy as a parent, and whether you're a parent is an advocate as well, but not to, even if you're not a parent and you're advocating with a family, not to allow your own biases and opinions to cloud or the parent's decision or the child's need. We want this to be the parent's decision in understanding what they want for their student and what the law allows for them, what the policies and procedures, what IDEA allows for, and helping them best way for them to find their voice, to be able to voice their concerns, and to be heard, because you can active listening is very important for all parties when you're talking with advocates, when you're talking with schools, and they should never push a parent to do anything that is not in the best interest of the child. So how you can, when you're selecting an advocate, you might ask the questions of how they can help you prepare for the meeting. They can review your child's educational records, and they should listen always to your concerns and help you generate ideas and suggestions for the strategies for the IEP team. They should help prepare for the areas of potential conflict. Like what ifs, if this happens, what could we do? And then helping them through those difficult conversations that we have to have sometimes. And like I said, we don't get calls from happy families. So the strategy is to help them where they're at and moving through that process through to success, which is collaborative communication and collaborative working together, finding that common ground to find the solutions.
I think, talking through this, the preparation part, Ellen, and the collaboration and some of the questions we've gotten, and kind of the caveats where we've said we understand that this doesn't mean things will be perfect. I want to mention, regarding parents' opportunity and schools opportunities to access dispute resolution options. If it comes to that point, nationwide data for mediation that's not related to due process. Okay. Agreement rates are at 70%. So about 3/4 of the time, parties are able to come to an agreement through that mediation process. Mediation is available through a state complaint and through due process, but it's also just available in general. And that is a very different service than an IEP facilitation. And that mediator really dives deep and leads that session and helps those parties try to get somewhere. The agreement rates are for mediation are much lower when it's related to due process. Typically because people are on the defense at that point. You're in legal defense mode. So I just wanted to mention that when we're talking about collaboration, that is still, it's okay to say, hey, we're in dispute. I really want to resolve this. And that's still early way to do that. That a lot of the time results in agreements. So I did want to mention that as well, based on some of the questions that we've had.
Allison, I feel like you just covered this, but I wanted to mention it because Carmen asked, she said, what is a parent supposed to do when they do understand the IDEA and they've went through all of the steps and still nothing changes? And I feel like you might have addressed it as she was sending it, but talking about the due process and the state complaints mediation, and you kind of just walked through those, but go forth.
Okay. Yeah. I hope that answered it, is that those are options afforded to parents and schools. And like I said, we can't guarantee results, obviously, but national data shows that mediation's not related to due process. That about 3/4 of the time are resulting in agreements. And that's that deep negotiation, and that mediator is there to help those parties not just communicate, but doing some reality testing and helping with the negotiation and helping get to the interests and understanding. And so that picture can look really different going through that process. And then there are, of course, other options if and when they're needed. Okay.
So, when selecting an advocate, another thing to keep in mind is, how do they approach disagreement with team members? And one of the things that really stands out to me regarding this is, a few questions. Do they respond aggressively? Do they approach conflicts with a collaborative mindset? Are they open-minded? Do they want to understand all perspectives? And as the three of us, continue to reiterate is that, are they focused on the student and committed to achieving the best outcomes? And, again, not to, sound like a broken record, but, families and schools will be working together for many years. And this is something that, needs to be kept in mind when you think about, okay, how are we all going to, approach a disagreement when that time comes? And who do we want as a part of our team to be able to, resolve those issues or move forward or develop strategies and solutions? And it's complex things to think about, but it is important when you think of the overall big picture. And as with many things in life, there are fees associated with things. And one of the most important things, I think, in my opinion, to think about is that when you select an advocate that might charge for their services, is to consider the financial implications associated with that. And to keep in mind that, like most things, whether it's, getting an attorney or, your salesperson and buying a car, just because they are charging a fee doesn't necessarily mean that they have your best interest at heart. And, and additionally, an advocate who charges professional fees, they can be really expensive, and their rates may not be affordable for many families. And, to keep that in mind when selecting your advocate is important, as, if you continue to engage in their, advocacy services, those costs add up, and that can create financial strain on a family and lead to long-term financial issues.
I think sometimes for when there's a charge associated, that puts a little pressure on to get a certain result. And again, there's no guarantee of a certain result or outcome regarding use of an advocate. And then for advocacy individuals or agencies who do not charge, I do think it's important to, like, how are they funded? Is there a certain organization who's funding them? And is there a mission associated with that, right? Are there certain priorities they have to meet? Does that organization receive specific technical assistance or training from reputable organizations? And what does that look like? And so I think when you engage, it's a service, right? That advocate is supporting you. And if you're going to engage in a service, having an understanding if there's anything that the parent needs to be aware of regarding that transparency as to what that need might be or what might be driving anything kind of in the background. Okay.
And with that, one of the things that is important to keep in mind is just the red flags, and picking someone who truly values the student at hand and really wants the best outcome for the student. And a true advocate prioritizes the best interest of the student family, and even, in some cases, just collaborating with the school and improving the relationship between the family and the school, as that's equally important. And, the goal of an advocate should not be to be adversarial or to, hinder the relationship between families and school districts, but rather to foster collaboration and to build those bridges to where, hey, we're focused on the student, and that is such an important piece. And I know that the three of us have really instilled that today, but it's important to keep in mind. And going back to, one of the things that's on this list is the, claim to be, a certified advocate. Again, there's not a certification for that. And, just to really be mindful and intentional in who you are choosing to advocate for your child is especially important.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about allies or adversaries and how what that looks like and how that can impact things. Um, I've linked it here again. So when we have this archived later, you can access the link. Also, it is on our website already currently on stakeholder training on the CERC website. Dr. Tracy Gershwin, she did a professional development series for CERC a couple years back, and it was a 6-part or a 6-module series. And she talked a little bit about a study, a qualitative study that talked with educators, parents, and advocates' perceptions and experiences with the role of special education advocates. And basically, what was discovered from this study was that there were 2 types of approaches, an adversary or an ally. And then she talks through the benefit to having an advocate. Because again, I think hopefully we've made this clear. We're not saying not to have one. Okay. It's very much, we see the importance of that role. Okay. So a benefit to having one to support parents through that conflict. But also that study revealed the need for advocate training because there's not anything like Abby has mentioned that's regulatory for advocates, and since it's not a regulated profession, it can be difficult to parse out where they're getting their information from, if it's accurate, and what that approach looks like. So, well, sorry, on this part, first want to say this is some of the results of that study that they're described. The ally advocate are described as knowledgeable, communicative, and collaborative. And being able to work with that whole team. They're there for the student. Yes, they're there to help the parent, but they're not there to support just everything the parent wants, because that might not be what is afforded under the IDEA, or it might not make sense for, again, getting to those underlying interests for the student and making sure that they have those roles of being that advocate for the student while supporting the family and being a team player to resolve those conflicts as you move through it. And those are just some of the quotes, the narratives that came out of the interview portion of the study from various perspectives of what an ally looks like, an advocate for the student, regardless of whether or not the parties wanted it. They were helping that parent, helping explain that perspective of what makes sense for the student. And then knowledgeable and educated, and again, having that best interests in mind. And then I think this was the advocates, a quote from an advocate perspective, that they're not there in contention. They're there to give that moral support. Okay. And so we understand that schools can sometimes go on the defense when there's an advocate there. We get it. And we're not saying that's right either, because that's not what the role is. They're there to help that parent, help advocate for the child. And we do lots of more than just webinars here to reach parents and schools and community members. We do lots of trainings in-house at districts for schools as well. And so we are very honest about this too, with them in school districts about how they need to be responding and hearing and being receptive to those things.
So we know that some of the benefits of, having an ally advocacy kind of relationship is the parent feels like they have someone on their side. I can remember my first MEEGS meeting, and you do feel very outnumbered and completely overwhelmed. And I think again, I will just state that it's so important for families to know and understand their rights. You're handed that parent rights in those meetings, but we're handed so much paperwork. Oftentimes, it's just we don't look at it again, or it's overwhelming, and so it's but that's something that the benefit of having an ally advocate can help you walk through that, understanding them better, understanding the proposal from the district, help, drawing on our own experiences to give the team and or the parent a better outcome solution strategy, and then just building that relationship to foster that trust. It's the trust is so important on both parties. So there's great benefit to working together and being there as a support for the family through the process, but keeping your focus on the student.
Okay, I briefly mentioned this earlier, but we can go a bit more here of how schools can work with ally advocates. Like I said, we discussed this with schools when we're in school districts doing trainings that schools need to understand what that advocate role is. It's to help serve the best interest of the child and to help parents effectively communicate. We were at a training recently where a parent had raised their hand and shared that the reason that they continued to use an advocate for now was because that they knew they get so emotional in those meetings and they wanted that person there to help support what they knew and had discussed prior, but they didn't want their emotions to get in the way of that effective communication in the context of the meeting. So knowing that that's really the role of them and to support their understanding and knowledge and that the school should be open to creative solutions, right? Being willing to listen and again, focus on the interests and not that position. I'm sure you can tell I love that visual and that process because it can help you navigate through so many conflicts. Listen to the phrase, what if? What if we did this? What if we tried this? And then, because status quo thinking, I get it. I've seen it, been there. Hey, we've always done it this way, right? It keeps teams stuck. And so we've talked to schools about this, being creative to meet the needs of students, and that being open to advocates who may have other experiences or suggestions to offer. Again, they may be involved in lots of different meetings at districts. Again, not necessarily saying, here's our demand, here's our position, but hey, we've seen other students with this similar need, that underlying interest, and here's how some other districts approach that. Is that something that could be considered here? But making sure that schools are willing to hear that. And then schools, like Ellen mentioned, you get your procedural safeguards, your parental rights as a parent. It's overwhelming. And you're like, what is this? After you've had this long meeting, right, where you're hearing all these things about your child, okay? But schools need to ensure when they're reviewing that information that there's information in there about advocacy organizations, dispute resolution, all sorts of stuff, and suggesting that. And if they notice that a parent might need some support that's beyond what the school can provide, because the school is supposed to educate the parent on their rights as well, then suggesting advocates to the parent, being willing to come up with that on the front end. And that can go a long way for the schools to foster that trust with the parents as well. All right, so back to kind of the flip side of the coin. In the study from Dr. Tracy Gershwin, an adversarial advocate, okay, can help, sorry, can exacerbate that conflict. They can make it worse. If they're unprofessional or overly emotional, they can come in accusatory. That's kind of what had come out of this study. And typically they can be argumentative or emotionally charged, is how that adversarial advocate approach has been viewed, is not helping move forward in that collaborative manner. And then again, here's just a couple of quotes from it. That the advocates sometimes, if they're adversarial, you make it more about the adults in the room. And again, while there may have been some conflict, that advocate can help redirect, right, the concerns back to the child, not about the adults or so and so that made some comment or 2 years ago, this other weird conflict that happened. Keep it refocusing that. And then that some advocates might not admit that they don't have that depth of knowledge and might be misinforming parties on what could happen. Or taking on a lawyer stance almost as if that they're in charge and can force a position, which even attorneys really can't do that either. And then they can't guarantee an outcome like that. And then there are some that are adversarial that come in ready to go to battle, this person says. The school's wrong, we're right. Again, it's positioning those parties against each other until instead of refocusing on the interest to try to move forward. And that can create a big barrier. So then we're talking about preventing adversarial advocacy. So some things, again, schools can do, like I mentioned earlier, of engaging in a partnership with the true ally advocates is schools could reach out to parents for concerns prior to the meeting, okay, and getting their concerns first so they can be prepared to address them. And making sure the appropriate people are there at the meeting. I know, I think it was Ellen that mentioned earlier, what advocates are not a team member. That doesn't mean parents can't bring their guests, right? They can bring it, but they're not a member of that IEP team making decisions for the child. There are those core team members that are required, but then there's some additional service providers who should be invited, but may not be required to be there at each time. However, if a parent has expressed concerns regarding, I'm going to give an example here, a child's speech and language services or occupational therapy services, you want to make sure that those people are present at that meeting because that one needs to be discussed. So when parents feel pushed off by schools or like, we've got to table this, we'll come back to it, it feels like you're not getting your questions answered. Again, that's not to say that parents are going to get every question answered the way in which they want it answered. Okay. But when you feel like you're getting pushed off, that increases that mistrust and frustration. And then when schools create a really good agenda to move forward, because that helps understand the team know where they're going to go. It keeps you focused instead of ruminating on certain issues, right? And it helps bring that team back to that purpose so you can address the concerns and the needs. Sorry, Abby.
You're fine. You're fine. You did great. One of the things that, as Allison kind of alluded to, is that, you know, meetings may become emotional. It is it is a highly contentious environment where you're, so, focused on the student, and those disagreements can often, you know, get entwined in feelings, or, end up the emotional brain, so to speak, ends up taking over. And it's important to, know yourself as a parent, or even the school, to know, as personnel, to know their limitations. And sometimes a break might be needed, or maybe we need to come back in a week, or whatever the schedule allows, for us to be able to sit down and clearly present our ideas. And one of the things that is at the heart of what we're talking about today is that idea of what is the solution, what is the parents solution, what is the school solution, how can we come to a middle ground. And if we need to take a break, or do things in the interim, then maybe that's necessary in order to obtain a solution.
All right. And then things that, again, schools can do and should be doing to help support the parents' true and meaningful parental participation, what the IDEA requires, right? Starting easy. Rather than necessarily starting with the areas of disagreement, is beginning with what might be mutually agreeable. Hey, here's where we know we're on the same page. Restarting with that collaboration and partnership. Okay. And then being open. Again, schools have got to be flexible and be willing to move out of that status quo thinking, think creatively, and not to be intimidated by advocates, because more brains can help with more ideas. That helps you, like we mentioned before, kind of get that unstuck. However, that doesn't mean that school team members, or that the IEP team, the full IEP team, should move forward with accommodations or services that the data doesn't support, because of pressure from an outside party. Okay. Because later you can look back at that data, and then how are you going to move forward and continue to make decisions without the appropriate data? They don't move forward because there's a pressure point or because of emotions, or like Abby mentioned earlier, because of thoughts and feelings, right? They're important, but they can't drive decisions. And then again, advocates are not members of the IEP team. They're there to help parents understand that IEP process. Okay. They can help parents understand some of those results and those proposals, but they can't push the team in one way if that data doesn't support it. And because they're not a member, okay, then that becomes difficult if teams are allowing that to interfere because they've got to have the parental participation as they move forward. And then continuing, making sure to address the parent. And I get it again, where advocates are really helpful, but that advocate cannot be the person that makes an agreement on behalf of the parent. They cannot be the person that says, yes, I'm okay to move forward on this. They are not the parent. So that IDEA affords meaningful parental participation. So the school has got to get the agreement or the questions or the next steps from the parent. And that, of course, the parent should be able to turn to their advocate and be there for support. But they can't be a decision maker, and the schools really need to ensure that parent is a part of that team. And then knowing when to intervene, like Abby mentioned earlier, that if there's an advocate, and this doesn't necessarily have to be an official advocate, sometimes parents bring their best friend or their sister or their mom, this other person who's not a team member, if they are dominating the conversation or interfering in the process, then team leaders need to be able to intervene so that the complete team has got to be able to move forward in some way. So knowing that they need to be monitoring and setting communication guidelines and sticking to them if needed, reminding the parties about those expectations. Here's how we're going to communicate and function, and be able to move forward as required teams, and making good decisions for the child, again, based on the data. So then again, if there are adversarial interactions, it doesn't mean that everybody just has to ruminate and go over and over and over it again. Um, you can offer your view, and the school can certainly document and move forward. You don't have to prove your position. People tend to get caught in this tennis match, is how I've described it before, when we're training at schools. Making sure you have the data to support it, because if there is an adversarial behavior, right, that doesn't help the team move forward. So you stick to the data, and if you don't have the data or the answer, then get the data so that you can make a decision to move forward on a need. You've got to respond to those parent concerns, but that doesn't mean you get embroiled in some back and forth, because that just continues to harm the relationship. And then sometimes divisiveness or just general heightened emotions can also just interfere in the process. And just being able to take a break, refocus the team back to the agenda, breaking that tension to remove the attention from those emotions or the divisiveness is really important, because again, this is an emotional process. There's going to be differing opinions, but that's not what you're there about. You're there about the child, okay? And then there's certain obligations that have to be met too. And that disengaging. You can take a break during the meeting, or you can certainly come back together at another time if things are so heightened that you can't move forward. It's a difficult process, or can be a difficult process. And if that's the case, then you can certainly involve a neutral third party, because they are there to help those parties communicate, like facilitation or mediation, which again is very different from that IUP facilitation. Or just going away, and that's another way that I think Ellen had mentioned earlier, that advocates can support bringing that parent's focus back to, and schools need to be able to bring that focus back. And sometimes that disengaging and reconvening can make a big difference. I don't know if y'all have anything else to add on that part, Abby or Ellen. Okay. Okay, and then again for parents, because I know Cadre. Ellen mentioned some of the stuff from Cadre about empowerment, which is so important, because that team member is the parent, And while advocates are incredibly helpful, like we've said before, parents should be educated on what they might need, right? So we just have linked here some no cost resources for parents to be able to continue some education for themselves as well. Is that Oklahoma Parent Center in partnership actually with the State Department of Education has put together a Super Six IDEA guidebook. Ellen, do you want to talk a little bit about that in your some of your trainings?
Yeah. The Super Six, as we call it, is actually the six principles of IDEA, and it's your parent rights, and it's broken down into, I think, understandable, friendly language, and it's accessible on our website. It's accessible on our partners' website. So please, if you can't find it, call me. I'll help you locate it. We'll send you a copy. And then we do trainings all across the state. Those are all in person and online, and then those are all located on our Facebook, all of our social media pages: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. You can find lots of information on all of those social media pages. So, and our website, of course, shouldn't leave that out. But yeah, and all of our services are at no cost to individuals. So it's we are here to serve and to support families and professionals that work with families and children with disabilities. So.
Okay, and then Cirque has webinars like these that we try to make hour to an hour and a half so that they're digestible with different topics. And oftentimes we will have guests come on that are experts in certain areas to talk about some things. So on our website, those get archived. And for the past 4 years, we have archived versions of those that help break down topics like FBAs and BIPs, behavior intervention plans, for those who don't speak the little abbreviated lingo. So just lots of things like that can be helpful. And then Cadre also has, I mean, we've got resources about communication as well, but Cadre, again, National Dispute Resolution Organization in partnership with the Office of Special Education Programs, have tips for parents in communicating with the school and ways in which they can engage. Um, and I know the State Department has parent rights. And Abby, do y'all still have, I think recently-ish, don't quote me on the year, there was maybe like a breakdown, like a guide breakdown, like a shortened guide to the parent rights, right?
So we have the parents' rights, and then we also have the parents' rights guide, and that is, as Allison said, a condensed version of the parents' rights, and that is also located on our website as well.
So what I can do is I can link that here too before we get all this archived and and because when we archive our webinars, it's the recording of this and the actual presentation. So I can make sure it's linked here as well. Okay. And then of course, you guys, all of our agencies are at no cost to parents and schools. And we're here to walk you through, answer questions, talk you through options, um, on all of that. So I think that gets us to the end. Thank you all so much. We've got a QR code there. If you can take a moment when you're able to just complete the evaluation. We're always trying to do better and improve our services and trainings. So whatever feedback you've got for us would be great if you can take a moment to do that. And Alyssa, I think we've got more coming.
Yes, yes. We also have our registration link for our January webinar. Dr. Kiter has put it in the chat. That webinar is over community resources, and we are going to have staff members from Able Tech, Sooner Success, and the Oklahoma Family Network joining us for that webinar. So that's going to be a lot of really good information. Go ahead and get signed up for that. And I think that is it. We have one more comment in the Q&A box. Miss Haley has stated that the Ties Center is also a great resource. So there is that as well. But otherwise, I thank everyone for your participation, and thank you to our panelists for joining us. We appreciate the input and everybody's time today. So thank you.